On the 5th of December 1872, the first mate of the brigantine De Gratia climbed aboard a vessel he had spotted drifting under partial sail in the North Atlantic, approximately 600 miles west of Portugal. The ship was the Mary Celeste. Her sails were set, though some were damaged. Her cargo was largely intact. Her compass was destroyed, her chronometer missing, her navigation instruments gone. The last entry in her log was dated 10 days earlier. The stove was cold, the food was prepared but untouched. A child's toy lay on a bunk. The captain's sword was still in his cabin, and not one of the 10 people who had been aboard her, the captain, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, the first mate, and 7 crewmen, was ever seen again. The mystery that followed was not the ship. The ship was fine. That is the detail that changes everything. She was found floating, navigable, structurally sound, a vessel later described by a salvaging seaman as fit to sail around the world. She was not wrecked. She was not on fire. She was not listing. She was simply sailing herself through the Atlantic, empty, in good enough condition that a small crew from the De Gratia sailed her 800 miles to Gibraltar without serious incident. The question that this documentary keeps returning to is not what happened to her. The question is why 10 people, including a young child, left a ship that was not sinking, climbed into a small open lifeboat in November Atlantic waters, and were consumed by the ocean without a trace. Not why the ship was abandoned in the chaos of obvious catastrophe, but why it was abandoned when, by every external measure, it should not have been. To understand that decision, you have to understand the world that produced it, and that world was far more fragile, far more economically pressurized, and far more institutionally dishonest than the legend of the Mary Celeste has ever admitted. The ship began her life in 1861 under the name Amazon, built in Nova Scotia, and she entered the world already carrying the weight of a compromised biography. Her first captain died of pneumonia before she completed her maiden voyage. She subsequently collided with another vessel in the English Channel and sank it. She ran aground at Cape Breton Island in 1867. She changed owners with a velocity that revealed less about maritime enthusiasm and more about a 19th century Atlantic shipping economy in which vessels were not maintained, they were milked. Each owner extracted what value he could from the existing hull, the existing insurance policy, the existing freight contracts, before quietly passing the depreciating asset to the next buyer at a marginally reduced price. When Richard Haynes purchased her at salvage auction for $1,750 in 1868, renamed her the Mary Celeste, and registered her under American colors, he was not rescuing a ship. He was relaunching a financial instrument under a new name, as if designation alone could override the material history embedded in her timbers. The industry allowed this because it was cheaper than the alternative. Genuine structural overhaul cost money and took time, and time in port was money lost. The maritime economy of that era did not reward caution. It rewarded throughput. Ships that sat idle in harbor for maintenance earned nothing. Ships that moved cargo, even marginally, even at risk, earned freight revenue. So vessels were patched rather than repaired, caulked rather than rebuilt, and sent back to sea because the financial logic of keeping them moving always outweighed the ethical logic of keeping them sound. The Mary Celeste was not an unlucky ship. She was a ship produced by an industry with no meaningful incentive to keep her lucky. By 1872, she had come under the partial ownership of a New York merchant named James Winchester, who invested roughly $10,000 in renovation, a substantial sum, and registered the ship under a new management arrangement. Winchester appointed Benjamin Spooner Briggs as her captain. Briggs was 45 years old, religiously devout, temperamentally conservative, professionally experienced, and, by every contemporary account, a careful and competent mariner. He did not drink. He ran what his colleagues called a dry ship, an unusual discipline in an era when alcohol rations were standard crew practice. He was known for fairness and precision. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of captain you would want commanding a freighter through the North Atlantic in November. He was also, by the autumn of 1872, a man under a particular kind of financial pressure that his professional reputation never quite revealed. Briggs had considered leaving the sea. He had corresponded with his brother Oliver about opening a hardware store. He had watched the early tremors of economic instability that would culminate in the Panic of 1873 and decided that land-based investment looked riskier than another Atlantic crossing. He had sunk a significant portion of his personal savings into a share of the Mary Celeste herself, first 1/64th, later increased to 1/3, which meant that his financial well-being was now inseparable from the ship's performance. He could not afford to delay the voyage. He could not afford to replace problematic cargo. He could not afford the luxury of time, and so he brought his wife aboard. Sarah Briggs was a capable, educated woman who had sailed with her husband before. Their older son, Arthur, stayed behind with relatives in Massachusetts to attend school, but their younger daughter, Sophia Matilda, was 2 years old, and the economics of separation, maintaining two households simultaneously, missing the earnings of a potentially long voyage, made it easier to bring the child along than to leave her. This was not standard practice on a working commercial freighter. A 2-year-old on a transatlantic cargo run was, by any practical measure, a complication, but the financial pressure was real, and the departure date was November 7, 1872, from Staten Island, New York, bound for Genoa, Italy, with a cargo of 1,701 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol. That cargo deserves a long moment of attention, because it is the element that has been most consistently underestimated in the 150 years of theorizing that followed. The barrels were made of red oak, a porous wood that allows vapor to seep through the staves, even when the liquid inside shows no visible leak. Denatured alcohol, rendered undrinkable by chemical additive, was commercially valuable as an industrial solvent, but it was chemically volatile in ways that the maritime regulatory environment of 1872 was entirely unequipped to address. There were no meaningful safety standards for volatile cargo. There were no inspection protocols requiring barrel integrity checks before loading. There were no ventilation requirements mandating that the hold be kept free of accumulated vapor. The insurance industry priced its premiums based on historical loss rates, not preventive engineering, which meant it was financially rational for carriers to accept marginal risk rather than invest in safety upgrades that would reduce premiums only marginally while increasing operational costs substantially. The hold of the Mary Celeste was a chemically unstable environment that no one with authority or financial interest had any particular reason to make safer. Before the ship even left New York, 9 of the 1,001 barrels had been found defective and replaced. That detail passed without significant concern at the time. It would later acquire a very different weight. The voyage began in rough weather. The North Atlantic in November is not a benign environment. It is a place of cold and wind and swells that measure a ship's structural integrity with relentless, impersonal force. The Mary Celeste made reasonable progress for the first several weeks, her logbook entries recording positions, weather conditions, and routine observations in Briggs's careful hand. The last confirmed entry was made on November 25th, placing the ship approximately 6 nautical miles north of Santa Maria Island in the Azores. This was a navigational fix of confidence, a known landmark, a coastal position, the kind of bearing that a careful captain would use to verify his chronometer's accuracy and confirm his charts. The problem was that the chronometer was wrong. Not wildly wrong, not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in the precise, quiet way that produces maximum danger, the kind of error that looks like accuracy until it doesn't. The instrument's drift placed Briggs approximately 120 miles west of where he believed he was. He thought he was 6 miles from Santa Maria. He was over 100 miles away. He was navigating through a phantom geography of his own making, a false map imposed on a real ocean, with real distances, real currents, and real weather that did not conform to his calculation. Every decision he made after that position fix was calibrated to coordinates that did not exist in physical space. He was, in a precise and terrible sense, a man who did not know where he was while being entirely certain that he did. This is the first of several simultaneous failures, and the documentary nature of the Mary Celeste case is that these failures did not occur sequentially, where one might have been addressed before the next appeared. They converged. They arrived together, layering pressure on pressure, in the space of hours, during conditions that allowed no margin for deliberation. The pumps were already a problem before the ship left port. The voyage immediately preceding the fatal crossing had carried coal, and coal dust is invasive. It infiltrates seals, clogs mechanism, works its way into precisely the components that need to move freely. The primary pump had been taken apart and laid on deck for attempted repair. This is what the Dei Gratia crew found when they boarded. The pump disassembled, its components exposed, as if someone had been working on it during the crossing itself. The secondary pump was operational, but with one pump down, the ship's ability to accurately assess hull integrity was severely compromised. A sounding rod, a simple measuring device used to determine water depth in the hold, was also found on deck, which means Briggs had been using it. He had been actively checking. The measurement he obtained indicated approximately 3.5 feet of water in the hold. This is important. 3.5 feet was not, in itself, a critical emergency. Modern analysis suggests it was within manageable range for a vessel of that size, particularly given the rough weather. The Dei Gratia crew, who had no particular reason to be cautious with another man's ship, and every financial reason to get it to port quickly, managed the same hold conditions without apparent crisis. But Briggs did not know that the water level was stable. Without a fully functional pumping capacity, he could not determine whether 3.5 feet represented the stable ceiling of normal seepage or the leading edge of progressive ingress. He could not run a trend analysis. He could only take a single reading and decide whether to trust it. And what he decided to trust was the thing that had been accumulating evidence of danger for days. Because beneath the question of the water level was the question of the cargo. The 9 barrels that had been replaced before departure were replaced for a reason. Barrel integrity had already shown signs of failure before the ship left New York. During the crossing, the ship's log recorded sounds from the hold, rumblings, reports, the ambiguous acoustic signatures of barrels shifting under pressure. In rough weather, with the hull working against Atlantic swells, these sounds would have merged into the general noise of the crossing, difficult to distinguish from the ordinary protests of timber and cargo under stress. But they accumulated, and in the final hours before abandonment, the evidence suggests that Briggs ordered the hold hatch open to inspect conditions below. What happened next has been reconstructed through experimental physics rather than eyewitness testimony, because there were no survivors. In 2006, a chemist named Andrea Sella conducted experiments demonstrating that denatured alcohol vapor, under the right conditions, could produce a rapid pressure wave explosion, a sharp concussive blast of force and heat that leaves no lasting burn marks, no charring, no structural damage. A flash event. The kind of explosion that sounds catastrophic and feels catastrophic, but, in the absence of sustained ignition, extinguishes itself almost immediately. If accumulated vapor in the Mary Celeste's hold had been disturbed by the opening of the hatch, exposed to fresh air or a spark from an improperly handled lamp, it could have produced exactly this kind of event. A sudden, violent pressure wave that blew open the hatch, threw those nearby off their feet, sent a rush of heat across the deck, and then simply stopped. No fire, no visible damage. No way, standing on that deck in the November Atlantic, to know whether the explosion had ignited something that hadn't yet shown itself, or whether it was already over. Imagine that moment, not as a reader processing historical information, but as a man standing on a deck with his wife and his 2-year-old daughter, 120 miles from land he believes is 6 miles away, with one pump disassembled, another potentially clogged, 3.5 feet of water of unknown trajectory in the hold, and a cargo of nearly 700 barrels of volatile alcohol that has just announced itself with a concussive blast. The chronometer says you are near shore. You are not. The pump says the water is manageable. You don't know if it is. The hold says the explosion is over. You cannot be sure. Benjamin Briggs was not a reckless man. He was a careful, experienced, financially pressured, devout, family-responsible captain making a prospective decision under radical uncertainty. The seaworthiness that investigators would later attribute to the Mary Celeste was a retrospective judgment made with full information. The Dei Gratia crew knew she hadn't sunk because they were boarding her days later. Briggs could not know she wouldn't sink because the data available to him at the moment of decision pointed in multiple directions at once, and the direction that pointed toward catastrophe was the one he could least afford to ignore. He made the call. They took the lifeboat. The navigation instruments went with them. Sextant, ship's papers, the captain's personal chronometer. This is a detail that gets overlooked in the romantic versions of the story. but it matters enormously. You don't take navigation instruments if you plan to stay tethered to the ship and reboard shortly. You take them if you intend to navigate independently. The rope trailing from the stern of the Mary Celeste had been cut. Not untied, cut, which suggests either significant urgency or the decision to cast off completely rather than maintain an umbilical to the vessel they had just determined was too dangerous to remain aboard. But here is where the mathematics of the situation become quietly merciless. The Mary Celeste, even without her crew, would continue to move under partial sail. Wind pressure on her hull and rigging created forward momentum that a small, open rowboat, heavily laden with 10 people, could not match. If Briggs had intended to remain nearby, monitoring the ship at a safe distance and reboarding when the danger passed, that plan would have become impossible within hours as the Mary Celeste pulled steadily away from them. And if he had cast off deliberately, intending to navigate to the shore he believed was 6 miles distant, he was navigating a small open boat toward a coastline that was actually 120 miles away. In November, in the North Atlantic, without shelter, without sufficient provision, without any means of signaling, the 10 people in that boat did not vanish because of pirates or sea monsters or dimensional anomalies or any of the supernatural constructs that the case subsequently attracted. They vanished because the ocean is very large and an open boat is very small, and the distance between where they thought they were and where they actually were was the difference between a difficult crossing and an impossible one. They were swallowed not by mystery, but by mathematics. The cold arithmetic of exposure, dehydration, and the Atlantic's complete indifference to human calculation. The Mary Celeste sailed on because she had no one aboard to stop her. She drifted for 10 days before the Dei Gratia spotted her. Captain David Morehouse, who commanded the Dei Gratia, had dined with Briggs in New York just days before the Mary Celeste's departure. They were professional acquaintances, possibly friends. When Morehouse recognized the ship and confirmed she was sailing erratically, without visible crew, he sent his first mate Oliver DeVoe and 2 others to board her. DeVoe quickly grasped what he had found, a salvageable derelict in international waters, in navigable condition, carrying an intact cargo. Maritime law was unambiguous on such matters. The salvors were entitled to a substantial portion of the vessel and cargo's combined value. DeVoe's letter to his wife, written shortly after, is one of the more unguarded documents from this case. "I shall be well paid for the Mary Celeste," he wrote. This was not callousness. It was commercial realism. Maritime salvage was a recognized profession with legal standing, and DeVoe made the entirely rational decision to divide the Dei Gratia's crew and sail the derelict 800 miles to Gibraltar to claim what the law said he was owed. The salvage hearing that followed in Gibraltar became something else entirely. Frederick Sully Flood was the Queen's proctor at the British Vice Admiralty Court in Gibraltar, a legal appointment that existed primarily to protect Crown interests in prize and salvage matters. By 1872, Sully Flood was a man who had arrived in this colonial post by a circuitous route that included gambling debts, professional disgrace in London, and a period of imprisonment. He had come to Gibraltar to reconstruct a career that metropolitan England had already finished. When the Mary Celeste arrived under salvage claim, Sully Flood saw not a procedural matter but a professional opportunity, and he converted a routine salvage hearing into a 3-month investigation that consumed the court's resources, generated considerable press coverage, and centered on a single thesis, that the Dei Gratia crew had committed an act of murder or conspiracy at sea. He had no evidence for this. The physical condition of the Mary Celeste actively contradicted it. There was no blood on deck, though he ordered chemical tests hoping to find some. And when traces appeared, later analysis attributed them not to human blood, but to fruit juice or other organic material. There was no sign of struggle. The cargo was untouched, which also contradicted the notion of piracy, since 1,701 barrels of commercially valuable alcohol would be obvious targets for anyone boarding with criminal intent. The personal possessions of the crew were intact, their valuables left behind. Briggs's sword was in its cabinet. His wife's jewelry was in her cabin. These are not the physical signatures of foul play. They are the physical signatures of a crew that left suddenly and intended to return. But Sully Flood pursued his theory with the intensity of a man who needed to be right more than he needed to be accurate. He was, in a deeply revealing way, projecting his own experience of financial desperation and moral compromise onto the sailors before him. A man who had himself gambled, defaulted, and fled could not imagine that a maritime incident might have a non-criminal explanation. His investigation told more about his psychology than it did about the Mary Celeste. He needed Morehouse and DeVoe to be criminals because that was the story his internal architecture demanded. The court ultimately awarded the Dei Gratia salvors £1,700, roughly one-fifth of the vessel and cargo's combined value, substantially below the one-third to one-half that successful salvors typically receive. This figure was not arbitrary. It was a carefully calibrated diplomatic transaction, high enough to avoid the embarrassment of denying salvage to men who had rendered genuine service, low enough to signal that official suspicion had not evaporated. The court protected itself by refusing to resolve what it was examining. A definitive finding of innocence would have required explaining what actually happened. A definitive finding of guilt would have required evidence that didn't exist. So the court manufactured ambiguity as a policy, settled on a number that encoded suspicion without constituting accusation, and closed its proceedings having answered nothing. This institutional cowardice had consequences that extended far beyond the salvage award. By leaving the case officially unresolved, the Gibraltar court created a vacuum that storytellers were quick to fill. In 1884, a young physician named Arthur Conan Doyle, not yet famous, working as a ship's surgeon, looking for material for his fiction, published a story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement in Cornhill magazine. The story was presented as a first-person account. It introduced, among other inventions, the misspelling Mary Celeste that would persist confusingly in popular culture for decades, and it provided the case with a narrative of racial violence and supernatural vengeance that had no connection whatsoever to historical evidence. Doyle never claimed the story was factual, but the fictional account spread further and faster than any newspaper correction, because it provided something the court could not: a cause, a villain, a coherent explanation. The public received Doyle's invention as revelation because the alternative, instrument error, pump failure, a man's rational decision under irrational data, offered no narrative satisfaction. Brand of death by miscalculation is existentially intolerable in a way that theatrical murder simply is not. So the Mary Celeste acquired a mythology, and the mythology served everyone who trafficked in. Journalists found audience, publishers found readers, lectures found fees. The permanent state of uncertainty that the Gibraltar court had institutionalized became a renewable commercial resource. Certainty closes the conversation. Ambiguity keeps it profitable. The case remained unsolved, not because the evidence was insufficient. The evidence read clearly, points in a coherent direction, but because an unsolved case generates continued interest, and continued interest generates continued revenue for those willing to supply new theories. The ship herself continued her life after 1872, passing through a succession of owners who extracted what value they could before moving on. She carried deck loads that damaged her hull. She lost horses on runs to Mauritius. She was operated on routes too demanding for her condition by owners who had no long-term investment in her structural integrity. Each transaction was rational from the individual owner's perspective. The cumulative effect was a vessel being incrementally destroyed by a series of decisions that none of them would have described as reckless. In January 1885, a Boston merchant named Gilman Parker sailed the Mary Celeste onto Rochelaure Reef in the Caribbean and wrecked her deliberately. The cargo she carried had been misrepresented to insurers: rotten fish, mislabeled goods, dog collars fraudulently listed as valuable merchandise. The ship had been insured for $30,000 or more against a cargo worth a fraction of that. Parker had calculated, correctly, that the insurance payout would exceed any value the vessel could generate through continued operation. He was wrong only about the investigation that followed. The fraud was detected. The co-conspirators were tried. One took his own life before proceedings concluded. Another appears to have suffered a mental collapse. Parker was convicted of barratry, the maritime crime of deliberately wrecking a vessel to collect insurance, and died in poverty within months of the verdict. The Mary Celeste, in her final act, destroyed the men who tried to exploit her. This is the detail that the cursed ship narrative finds irresistible, and it is worth examining why. The pattern of bad fortune that followed the vessel through 24 years, first captain dead on maiden voyage, subsequent owners losing money, crew disappeared, final captain convicted and ruined, reads from the outside, like evidence of supernatural design. It reads this way because human cognition is pattern-seeking to a degree that exceeds pattern reality. We see causal chains because we need causal chain. We need the curse because the alternative, normal operational variance in a high-risk industry that routinely destroyed ships, careers, and lives through the compound accumulation of small decisions, is not narratively satisfying. It is, however, accurate. The truth underneath the Mary Celeste story is not a single dramatic event. It is a layered accretion of pressures, each one individually manageable, collectively catastrophic. A ship built without adequate standards, maintained without adequate incentive, loaded with cargo subject to no meaningful regulation, navigated by instruments with no redundant verification, commanded by a financially entrapped captain, carrying his family across an ocean in November. Every single one of these conditions was produced not by accident, but by choices, by an industry that had determined, through financial logic, that safety was less profitable than exposure, that maintenance was less valuable than throughput, that the cost of a lost crew was borne by the sea rather than by the owners who sent them there. Benjamin Briggs made a decision based on the best information he had. The best information he had was wrong. He believed he was near shore. He was not. He believed the explosion from the hold was a warning of ongoing danger. It may have been over. He believed abandonment was the rational response to unquantifiable risk, with his wife and his daughter and 7 men whose lives depended on his judgment. He was not panicking. He was calculating. He was doing exactly what an experienced, careful, responsible captain was supposed to do, reading the available evidence and acting on its implication. The evidence he had was built on false foundation, and the false foundations were built by an industry, a regulatory environment, a financial structure, and an era that had decided it was cheaper to send men to sea on compromised instruments, in compromised ships, with compromised safety protocols, than to build the kind of infrastructure that might have kept them alive. The chronometer's drift was not Benjamin Briggs's failure. It was the failure of a maritime economy that provided no redundant verification system, because redundancy cost money and the dead were not, under the prevailing logic, a liability that outweighed the savings. The ship that the Dei Gratia found sailing herself through the Atlantic in December 1872 was not haunted. She was honest. She was in better condition than her history warranted, navigated by no one, sustained by physics alone, carrying intact in her hold the cargo that had terrified her crew into the ocean. She was, in the most literal sense, the most honest thing about the entire story. A vessel that turned out to be fine, floating through a sea that had already taken everyone who could no longer trust her. What persists is not a mystery. What persists is the much more uncomfortable reality that 10 people died because they were operating inside a set of interlocking failures, technological, economic, regulatory, psychological, that each appeared manageable in isolation and became lethal in combination. We have called it a mystery for 150 years because mystery implies that there is still a hidden answer waiting somewhere, an explanation that will eventually arrive and make sense of the void. But the void is the explanation. The absence of the crew is not a puzzle awaiting solution. It is the precise and final outcome of every compromised decision, every deferred maintenance item, every regulatory gap, every financial pressure, every false instrument reading, every barrel that leaked a little before anyone checked, all of it converging on a November morning somewhere in the Atlantic, where a man who didn't know where he was made the only decision he could with the information he had. And the ocean took everything after that. The Mary Celeste has been sailing through the cultural imagination for a century and a half because we keep boarding her looking for ghosts. What we find, every time when we actually look carefully at the hold, at the pump, at the chronometer, at the court records, at the financial ledgers, at the cargo manifest, is something that requires no ghost at all, only the ordinary, unremarkable, devastating capacity of complex systems to fail quietly, in parallel, without warning, and without anyone watching who has both the authority and the incentive to stop them. That capacity is not gone anywhere.